The following report contains some disturbing images.
They are images of individual tragedy and trauma that reflect a crisis gripping an entire continent. A crisis that has left Britain under huge pressure to do more to help the thousands of refugees heading for Europe. On a visit to Spain, David Cameron finally acknowledged that pressure and promised that Britain would go further.
Britain is a moral country with a moral conscience, and we respond rightly to humanitarian crises, and that is why we will be taking thousands of Syrian refugees. But let's not pretend that that alone will solve the problem.
But the refugees he wants to bring to Britain are not those who've struggled their way to Europe, but those here in the camps and cities bordering Syria, where millions live in extreme hardship. Today, Mr Cameron announced another 100 million in aid for these refugees, and in coming days he's expected to expand an existing scheme that brings hundreds of the most vulnerable to Britain. We don't know how many will come or when, but they will number in the thousands, not tens of thousands. Won't some people see this as a token gesture that doesn't actually address the real humanitarian need, nor does it actually address the fundamental cause of this crisis?
We must act in all the ways that the British people would expect. That is why we were the first to send the Navy to the Mediterranean to save lives. That is why we have done far more than any other European country to fund those refugee camps, the increase in funding I've just given today. And that is why we have allowed Syrian refugees to come to our country and will continue to do so.
To his great frustration, David Cameron has found himself behind the curve of public opinion on this, both at home and abroad. His response is to say that Britain has spent more on Syrian refugees in the Middle East than any other EU country, which he says is reducing the numbers heading for Europe. But that cuts little ice with Chancellor Merkel of Germany and President Hollande of France, who today wrote to EU leaders calling for a binding mechanism for resettling refugees in all member states, something Mr Cameron opposes, something Scotland's First Minister supports.
As an EU member state, we have a duty as well as a moral and humanitarian obligation to face up to our responsibilities and accept a fair and proportionate share of refugees. We can't leave it to others to shoulder the responsibility alone.
And still they come. More pictures from the Mediterranean showed yet more boats packed with refugees, boats that UKIP said had to be stopped.
I would have thought that if the European Union wants to help genuine refugees, they need to establish offshore centres and process people correctly rather than inviting what has now turned into a headlong rush.
And what a rush it is. These were the scenes today on the Greek island of Lesbos as hundreds of Afghans tried to storm a ferry heading to Athens. Scenes that look unlikely to stop, however many refugees Britain takes in. James Landale, BBC News, Madrid.